Woman, an in-depth exploration of the world of women today with Samantha Dean.
Good evening. Tonight our topic is birth control for the sexually active teenager. More teenagers are sexually active today than ever before, and as a result, adolescent pregnancy is reaching almost epidemic proportions. This is a matter of grave concern to parents, teachers, and state legislatures throughout the country. With us this evening to discuss this problem are Mr. Stephen Salyer, who is the youngest member of the President's Commission on Population Control. He is also the President and National Co-Chairman of the Citizens Committee on Population and the American Future, which he founded with John D. Rockefeller the Third. With us also is Dr. Stanford Copley, a practicing obstetrician and gynecologist who is on the faculty of the State University of New York at Buffalo. Sexual activity amongst minors is more or less a fact of life today, right? And how should we respond to this as parents, as teachers, and as lawmakers?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to deal with some of the myths that surround the whole discussion of sexual activity among unmarried minors. And among those myths are, number one, that young people are no more sexually active today than they have been in the past. Our evidence indicates the contrary, that in fact something in the neighborhood of half of young women by age 19 have now had sexual intercourse. I think secondly, there's a great feeling among parents and educators that they have nothing to say to young people, that counseling is unnecessary because, in their words, kids know more than we do. They're so well informed today that they really don't need our help. They know more about sex than perhaps even we do. That's simply inaccurate as well from the findings of a variety of researchers around the country. Young people don't understand their bodies, and there seems in some instances even to be a reverse correlation between the amount of early sexual activity and the willingness of young people to discuss sexual behavior and ways to prevent pregnancy, and their knowledge about those subjects. So I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that there is a problem. Secondly, to say that we're not dealing straightforwardly with the problem, and young people do have needs that we're not responding to.
How would you suggest parents go about counseling their children on this matter?
Well, one thing I find it especially frustrating that we often end up dealing with the teenager who is under 16, who has had no prior conversations with her parents on this subject, and often finds herself in a difficult situation, such as suspecting venereal disease or possibly pregnant, and with nowhere to turn. And this is the teenager that isn't often reached by the parents, the home, and the school, and consequently it's usually a stranger that in some way takes over the management of this child or this developing young woman. And often the lack of communication between this young girl and her parents is most disturbing. Often the young girl will insist that her parents not be involved in any discussion period. And you find, because of the way the laws are, the parents have to eventually become involved. And it's a very traumatic experience for the child and the parents, who find out for the first time that they are dealing with, in their home, with a sexually active, rather young adult, young woman who has had certain wants, needs, and desires that they have never been able to interpret or understand, and consequently there's a great problem, and the problem is communication.
But do you feel that certain parents perhaps experience certain reservations or raise objections and even have difficulty in coming to terms with the fact that their 12, 13, 14-year-old child is sexually active, and perhaps if they give them birth control or give them education along these lines, this is sort of giving tacit approval or even actively condoning any later ensuing sexual relationships?
Well, I believe that the attitude between the parent and their child begins developing very early in the child's life. A very young child, even in the preschool age range, can come home with questions that the parent's response can be very important to. A parent that hears a child come in with an honest and simple-minded question and says, gee, that's something we don't talk about, or gives the child the impression that sex is somehow dirty or something that isn't discussed in the home, lays, I think, a groundwork for a series of very difficult situations where the child doesn't feel free to discuss these matters with the parent. So I think even at the very earliest level in the child's life, the parent can begin expressing an openness toward sexual discussions that carries through into the child's later life so that they can deal with problems straightforwardly. And secondly, I think there's no indication that the offering of sound information is in any way an encouragement of any kind of sexual promiscuity.
I would agree with that. I think if the parent shows a certain willingness to discuss things openly and fairly with the child and not intimidate the child will respect the parent's opinion much more than if the child is simply forbidden without basic understanding and knowledge to engage in certain activities. Sexuality is part of our lives. It begins from the crib. It doesn't have to necessarily lead to sexual intercourse at an early age, but it can because of many of the frustrations and the rebellious attitudes of some of the younger children. And if you had a greater understanding and openness that was presented in the home, where things could be worked out and discussed prior to the actual adventure, certain things might change, and at least the child would feel that there was a place somewhere to turn to for discussion before they finally made any decision, and didn't have to feel that they were forced into a decision, maybe on the basis of pressure from a boyfriend, where they had no one else to turn to discuss and receive love and warmth. And consequently, the whole matter of birth control becomes one of after the fact. The patients I see in the office who request birth control, the young ones in particular, have already had intercourse many times. They don't come in often for birth control until they've been frightened by the first late period or until they're already pregnant and it's too late.
How about parents who have strong religious or moral scruples about educating their children along these lines?
Well, I believe that parents should be able to convey to the child how they feel. At the same time, not necessarily brutally disagree in such a way that the child will no longer offer his own feelings for examination. If the child knows he's going to be completely rejected because he feels differently than his parents, then he will no longer offer his feelings or her feelings, and the child will go elsewhere with them. If the parent wants to keep a certain communication, certain openness in the family, there has to be room for dissent, even if it is not to their liking.
In addition to that, I think you have to cut to the core of what you mean by religious or what you mean by moral, and it's the same studies that have indicated that somewhere near half of girls by age 19 are involved with sexual intercourse also show that in the minds of most young people, sex is still very eminently wrapped up with feelings of love and affection for another human being. And I think that runs counter to a lot of people's notion of promiscuity, or what they define as promiscuity, of people sleeping around with lots of partners and that sort of thing. The indications are that most young people, when they begin engaging in sexual activity, are thinking of it in terms of a single partner, about whom they care very deeply.
I think that's a very good point, and parents are unwilling to accept this if they themselves do not like the boyfriend, which is unfortunate because they're not giving the girl involved an adequate chance to work out a relationship. It's very true that eventually the girl may grow away from this boy, and really, in reality, unless the girl gets pregnant, nothing will have been lost, except she will have made an adjustment and become more mature and be better able someday to choose the person that she will someday choose to spend her life with. Most people in so-called stable communities know that they experience a great deal of instability in marriages. Marriages are not stable in spite of the ways people have been brought up until this time, and we hope maybe for the future, with a little more understanding, marriages will become more stable.
There were a good number of major medical associations which have come out and taken a stand in favor of giving birth control to teenagers. Could you just list those for me?
Well, in particular, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists polled their members, and this is the major group of obstetrician gynecologists who would have to deal with this problem, and approximately 80% of their members agreed that sexually active teenagers should be given birth control. This gets to be kind of a problem in states in which the law says that young girls under the age of 17 can't even be examined without their parents' consent. In New York State in particular, it has gotten to be easier for the physician to prescribe birth control because he is able to examine any teenager without parents' consent if he's looking for possible venereal disease. But this is not true in all states.
There were several others, weren't there? There was the American Academy of Pediatricians and the American Academy of
Medical
Family
Association
Physicians
also
and
came out in
the
favor
AMA.
of...
Right, yes.
And I think it's important to realize, in addition, that the public at large has come around on this issue as they've become more aware of the dimensions of the problem. In a survey that was done for our National Commission on Population about a year ago, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70% of people throughout the country, and this cut across regional and religious and occupational and so on lines, felt that teenagers who were sexually active should have access to contraceptive services. Also, there was a very high percentage, about 80%, that felt if these services are to be provided, that it was very much proper for state and federal agencies to assist in the provision of those services, either through funding or actual assisting in the information and service function.
And this commission, the present Commission on Population Control, this took its stand after the other associations took their stand, did it not?
That's correct, although there are a number of additional groups that are now re-examining their attitudes toward younger people, groups like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and the Campfire Girls and so on, that deal literally with millions of young people and deal with them not only when they're in late adolescence and are talking about sexual relationships and whether or not to have sexual relationships with their boyfriends or girlfriends of one kind or another, but also younger children and thinking about their attitudes toward each other and toward members of the other sex and members of their own sex, and occupational preferences. The Campfire Girls, for instance, are talking a lot about alternative roles for women, and they're trying to encourage even the very youngest children from 5 and 6-year-old groups to begin thinking about themselves as full people instead of as women who have a very narrow or constricted role to consider for their life. And I think in the long run, that kind of broadening of people's perspectives may be crucially important for their later attitudes towards sex and relationships to one another.
Could you talk for a moment about some of the objections that were raised when you were doing research for the Commission in respect to supplying teenagers with birth control devices?
Well, I'll mention a couple of things, and I'm sure the doctor would add to those. First, I think there are a number of people who feel that this is something, sex education and sex attitudes are primarily the concern in the home, and that it's a mistake to talk about those in any sort of settings outside of the home, whether it be a doctor's office or a clinic of some kind or whatever. I think basically the Commission agreed that many important sexual attitudes are developed in the home, but that the fact of the matter was that services and counseling were not being delivered. And while we were doing a totally inadequate job in parent education and should try to improve on that there were needs to be dealt with at the moment. Also, I think in the minds of many people, there's still the thought that the provision of information, the frank discussion of sexuality will lead to what they call promiscuity, and no one wants to place a definition on that because they feel very uncomfortable with anything they can come up with, but they believe that it does lead to all sorts of aberrant social behavior of one kind or another. And I think our Commission tried to say in both instances that is not the case, and that we had to begin very seriously addressing the issue.
So you don't think much of the validity of these objections?
We haven't been able to discover any evidence that indicates that ignorance is a good barrier to sexual involvement. In fact, ignorance only promotes sexual activity between young people that's ill-informed and leads to all sorts of undesirable consequences like pregnancy and venereal disease and so on.
It should be pointed out that approximately 5 to 7% of all the pregnancies in this country every year are by children under the age of 16. And this, of course, is disastrous for the individuals that are involved with the unpleasant choice of having the baby, dropping out of school, or perhaps seeking an abortion in the states where it is permitted. All these problems create a great deal of pressure for a young child who is just embarking on their growing up period, forming relationships, and if it's disturbed by pregnancy or by very unpleasant experiences, this may leave them marked for the rest of their life in their social relationships. Many teenagers even do not have the basic facts on when they are able to conceive, even though you would have thought that by now they would have learned it in the home. A study was done recently that showed 60% of all young junior high school girls had no idea when they ovulated. Now, obviously, if they're going to be exposed to sexual relations at times, even though the percentage might only be 20 or 30%, these are the girls who can get pregnant and who are the most involved in being at risk.
Well, what is the law as it stands today on treating minors in a gynecologist's office, either in connection with VD or in supplying birth control over the states? How does it exist today?
Well, it varies throughout the states. It is a matter primarily of state law and of medical practice. Some states, like California, for instance, have tried to pass what are variously termed emergency clauses of their statutes, which permit a physician in certain clearly specified situations to deal with a minor without parental consent. Oddly, we've been more willing to give physicians that kind of flexibility in the area of treatment of venereal disease than we have in the area of dealing with what largely causes venereal disease, which is sexual activity, and trying to avoid, as a preventative measure, the adverse effects of those things. So all too often, as was pointed out, we're seeing young people when they've already developed a problem, and when, in a sense, we're already applying remedial medicine, when in fact, if there were situations that were sensitive to their needs, established clinics and facilities where young people could freely come and get services and counseling, we'd be on the preventative end of the whole situation.
There are a number of teen clinics, though, which are proliferating throughout the country, aren't there?
That's correct. Many of those teen clinics operate outside the law, unfortunately, under the good graces of doctors and other health personnel who understand the dimensions of the problem and, in a sense, put their necks on the chopping block. Others are severely restricted because of local pressures or enforcement of laws. And many of these street clinics also, or other outside the mainstream establishments, find it very difficult to get funding to support their activities. They're giving away contraceptives that are samples from drug companies and so on. That's not an unusual situation at all in many clinics throughout the country.
There are many who think, though, that if the law was changed, there would be a rise in the rate of promiscuity. Is there any evidence to back this up, do you feel?
I've not been able to have that feeling that the junior high school and the high school students are the ones that are holding back from sexual activity, awaiting for a go-ahead from some official organization that would now say you can get birth control. In many cases, it is still a question of their own attitudes towards their boyfriends, their families, and their surrounding environments that make the greatest differences. We can see how in the farm areas, as contrasted with the urban areas, the changes in attitudes, and this isn't because of the more availability of birth control. It's strictly on a social basis, I would say.
You yourself have told me that you have certain reservations about giving birth control to teenagers in your office. Would you care to elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, the biggest problem is that we do not have 100% safe, 100% effective contraceptive. So the same reservations can occur with older women as well. However, when you're dealing with a teenager who is being taken care of by parents who have no knowledge of what is going on, you're dealing with potential problems that the parents will later become involved in at a time when they had no say in their making. Consequently, it takes a great deal more courage, actually, to prescribe the birth control pill to a 15 or 16-year-old girl without her parents' consent, if she may fall into the risk group of getting a blood clot or an embolus during the time when she's on the pill and have to be hospitalized and then have to face her parents with the truth about the matter as to why this blood clot occurred.
So what is the preferred method of birth control that you would offer to teenagers?
I still feel it is the birth control pill because it is the only one that is 100% effective, and although there is a risk, there is a much greater risk for that teenager if she would get pregnant.
I think it does. The issue of contraceptives that are appropriate and 100% safe and effective for young people opens the door to the whole debate of contraceptive adequacy for the entire population. And it's symptomatic with young people because the pill's effects can be more acute there. IUD, rejection of the intrauterine device, is more common among people that have not had children, and particularly younger people. Severe bleeding and that sort of thing is more prevalent. But these are problems that run throughout the age span, and I think our attention to developing of better contraception is something that we've lagged way behind in this country, and it would certainly make the job of physicians trying to deal sensitively with people's problems a little easier.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, an effective morning after pill without side effects could head off some of the potential problems if it was made available to teenagers who knew they could get it if they needed it. However, this is a problem that is still being worked out. Unfortunately, the present medication that's being tried as a morning after pill has many side effects.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the erotic sort of ambience and the sexual saturation that we get from the media and from books and so on has the effect of suggesting to the teenager that if he's not participating, if he's not having sexual activities, there's something wrong with him?
Well, I feel there's a very strange dynamic at work in society that allows all sorts of advertising of X-rated movies and so on in the media, and yet so many of the print media sources and broadcast media are unwilling to run advertisements dealing with contraceptives or to talk forthrightly about problems of human sexuality. There seems to me to be a certain misrepresentation there of what the dimensions of human sexuality are all about. I think we're all guilty of this. We're guilty of it in the schools. We're guilty of it in the churches. We're guilty of it in all sorts of community groups, and we're guilty of it in the home. We're afraid to talk about sex in its proper perspective and its proper dimensions honestly and so on. And what this does is leave the younger person the victim of all sorts of extreme formulations of what sex and sex relationships are about, and it can't help but foster false conceptions and further misinformation.
Mm-hmm.
Most people would prefer that their children make a good sexual adjustment, and that I mean most people would prefer that the day that their children are old enough to get married, that they would be happy sexually and make good sexual partners. What they don't realize is that this has to be preceded by many years of development, which involve experimentation as well as with the other sex, as well as masturbation, and most parents are unwilling to give their children the opportunity for this development, and they're unwilling to acknowledge that it is occurring without their consent. And consequently, we have these problems, and the problems are more blinders that parents put on themselves to shut out the fact that their children are developing sexually right under their eyes, that the beginnings of it are in every contact in the schools or on the streets between the opposite sex, which basically is the sex play that leads up to some relationship and which is healthy.
Mm-hmm. Well, do you think this sort of repressive attitude then is responsible for teenagers trying to establish a separate identity, perhaps rebelling against the forces of authority and tradition, and this can sort of snowball into a potentially disastrous situation?
I don't think teenagers believe that sex is bad, no matter what their parents say. They can see war on television, they can see so many other things, and it's hard for them to think that sex can be bad in the same way when it means affection and kindness towards somebody that they care for. And for us to try and make them feel that it's bad, I think is the wrong tact entirely. I think if we can try to show them where there may be times and places where it is more advantageous for them to engage in sexual relations, that the time and the place should be of their choosing and not be one in which they get forced into by either group activities or by their boyfriend or girlfriend at that particular time. But this is the approach that parents should be taking in the home and allowing free and frank discussion of what is good and when it should occur.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about peer pressure? Do you think this is has an effect upon children? The fact that everybody else is doing it and they feel out of it and just not with it if they're not participating?
Well, I think there's no question that now plays a part as it has in the past. The old discussions that teenagers had 20 years ago, by the time I'm 18, I'm over the hill, I better go out, and particularly males, I better go out and see how much I can get before I go over the hill, still prevalent today among large segments of the teenage population. But I think it plays to this larger issue of the ability of people to talk honestly, to develop attitudes that go beyond that, and certainly the parents play an important part in that, and their peers can play an important part in it too. But they don't have the opportunity to discuss sex in the classroom. They discuss it behind the school building. They don't have a chance to talk about it in the church. They talk about it after church lets out and in the parking lot, or they talk about it on the street or wherever. This is not going to stop. It's going to always go on. But there are settings, I think, that those who care about the attitudes that children are forming can foster where a very open and honest expression of sexual views can be exchanged and children can mature.
The times that I've been invited to speak in the schools, the health classes, I found it very refreshing, the number of questions, the interest of the students, the starvation almost for this type of knowledge. And in a mixed setting, there is very little embarrassment or fear. Children or teenagers are willing and able to ask questions that are sensible, things that they have never been told and should have been told. And it doesn't involve only on questions of birth control, but just questions of their own body, questions of function. And this is the type of thing that more has to be done with, as well as education in the home.
Just one quick question before we close. What do you think is the impact on a personality of, say, 13 or 14 of having sexual relationships and starting that early?
I think there could be problems. I don't think the average teenager at this age is ready to handle a very deep relationship which involves sexual intercourse. However, they might get trapped into it, and that's why the percentages just begin at this point. But they have to know that they can be counseled and that this can be discussed, and they're not all bad because they've gotten into this situation, and they may agree that it was unwise at this point.
I would agree that kind of reinforcement is crucial for the child to develop and continue to develop a healthy attitude toward their sexual activity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salyer. Dr. Copley, good night. We'll see you again next week.